We started off earlier talking about strong personalities. If you were here just before church started, if not, you missed an amazing connect and share. We do that just before church starts. We're going to talk a little bit more about strong personalities right now. There are certain people who just have like a personal presence about them. Have you experienced that in your life? When they walk into a room, everybody looks at them, even if something else was going on beforehand, and they're not even doing anything. They just kind of have a presence about them, and everybody pays attention to them. My dad was a person like this. Maybe you have a person like this in your life. When you're around a person like that, what is it like? Think about that. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about, as an illustration today, one of the strongest personalities in history. Okay? And this is a story, I really love this story, even though the guy isn't really that great of a guy. Who is this? This is Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was certainly one of the strongest personalities in history. He was, what is Napoleon famous for? Yeah, that's right. So actually, that's what I thought would come out first. He's famous for being short. Okay? He was 5'3". Now, this was in, he most of his career, the height of his career was like in the very early 1800s. And so people were a little bit shorter then. So he wasn't quite as short, maybe as you imagine, 5'3", compared to other people, but he was much shorter than all the men around him, certainly. And yet, as a young man, when he was in the army and then as an officer in the army, people were just drawn to him. He seemed to be absolutely fearless in the face of battle. It was like he just utterly believed that nothing could kill him. And people were drawn to him. When people were around him, they just believed that he could win, no matter what. No matter what the odds, they believed that he could win. And there is an amazing story about Napoleon. So he conquered, some of you will know this. We're not going to go through all of the history of the French Revolution. That would be really boring and really depressing. But he conquered all of Europe, okay? Napoleon conquered all of Europe, and then he invaded Russia, which is always a bad idea. He invaded Russia, and that didn't go so well for him, and eventually he lost this big battle, and his empire collapsed in on him, and eventually Paris itself was taken, and he was forced into exile. Okay, this is in, I think, like 1814. He was forced into exile on the island of Elba. Okay, and so everybody thought Napoleon's done, right? He just lost his entire army. He lost his whole empire. And then he made a comeback. After 11 months in exile, in 1815, he made a comeback, and it is stunning. So what happens in the comeback is this. Napoleon basically just sneaks off the island with a small number of people who are with him, okay? And he gets back to France. And he's got like a small number of troops, like, I don't know, maybe 1,000 troops at the most, which might sound like a lot, but it's not. Okay, there was a king in France again, and there was an army, there was the king's army, and they were all sworn to destroy Napoleon if he ever decides to come back. And there's, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 soldiers in the French army. There's so many soldiers in France. And Napoleon marches back with his very small number of guys, and they encounter, everybody knows he's coming back. As soon as he hits France, word about it spreads immediately, and he encounters one of the first divisions of the French army. Okay, these are guys who have sworn to protect the king and kill Napoleon. And they don't know him. They're not like his friends or anything. The two armies, the enemy army, the king's army, much larger than his, approach each other, and there's silence for about 30 seconds. And then Napoleon's ranks open up, and Napoleon himself, all 5'3" of him, walk out in front of the opposing army. Okay? I've told this story before, but it's just so striking. The whole army, the opposing army, has rifles, muskets aimed at him, and he seems totally unafraid. He just walks out in front of them. And he says, if you want to kill your emperor, go ahead. And no one fires. He hardly does anything. And after a couple of minutes of silence, one of the troops in the king's army yells, "Long live the emperor." The whole king's army start crying, they start weeping. Some of them throw themselves at Napoleon's feet, and they all join his army. He then continues to march on to France, and a bigger army confronts him, and it happens again. And within 4 days, the entire king's army has joined Napoleon without one shot being fired, and the king and all the nobles have to flee France. He took over France with nothing but the strength of his personal presence. What? Now, come on. So that's got to be one of the strongest personalities in history. We're going to use this today to understand something very important about God. Okay. We're in a series right now called Resurrection. And we've done a couple of messages. Tyler gave the message last week. It was fantastic. I wasn't here, but I watched it online. The series is called Resurrection, and we're looking at the idea that God can bring the dead back to life. So in this series, we're doing a few things. Number one, this is sort of the main point of the series. This is what Paul says, and we'll come back to this. Paul says at this certain moment when he's on trial in front of two different officials, one is a king and one is a Roman governor, he says, why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Why should anyone consider it unbelievable or impossible that God would bring the dead back to life? His point is that you shouldn't. But this is the thing that keeps many people from believing. There is actually lots of evidence. That's one of the things we're going through in this series is evidence. There's actually a lot of evidence that Jesus did come back to life from the dead. And in this series, we're looking at lots of evidence that God has built into the world that, in fact, all the dead will come back to life one day. That's something that God has promised will happen. But many people hear that, and they say that just can't be. That's impossible. So that's what we're trying to confront in this series, is this feeling that really when someone has died, could their body really, like I said earlier, Gloria passed away. Her body is currently dead. Her spirit is alive with God. But I said earlier that one day her physical body will come back to life. And she's going to jump up out of the grave and shout for joy. Can that really be? Does it seem to you, even if you're a Christian, it might seem to you like, could that even be possible? So this is the thing we're confronting in this series. Because the thing about God is he brings the dead back to life. This is something that he's been communicating to us over and over again. But there are some obstacles in the way for us actually believing this, okay? So we're looking at resurrection, the idea of resurrection throughout the Bible, and we're doing this in 5 stages, so this will go up through Easter Sunday. And we looked at the books of Moses, so that's what we did a couple of weeks ago. I did that message. Tyler looked at the idea of resurrection, what God says about resurrection in the Psalms. These are different parts of the Bible, if you're not familiar with these. Today we'll be looking at the idea of resurrection in the prophets. And there's some really powerful passages in there. And then we'll be looking at next week, we'll be looking at Jesus' resurrection itself. And on Easter, we'll actually be looking not at Jesus' resurrection, but the future. What's going to happen, what God says is going to happen in the future for all human beings and for those who believe in him, who put their trust in him. So, a key image and the sort of the anchor for this series of messages is this moment, which I already referred to, where Paul was speaking before King Agrippa. And this happened in the late 50s, not the 1950s, the 50s, the actual 50s. Okay? And here's the moment, okay? Back in the 50s. It wasn't actually that long ago, really. I know, it was 2,000 years ago. It's not that long ago. Almost 2,000 years ago. Time goes by real fast. Some of you who are younger think that 10 years is a long time. Those of us who are older know that it's not, don't we? So here's the moment, and this is powerful. This is an image. So this is Paul. This is Paul the Apostle, okay, who wrote much of the New Testament, and who is, at this point in his life, he is an older man, and God has taken him through so many things. He's almost died on a number of occasions because people tried to kill him for preaching about Jesus. He's now on trial for his life. Next to him, or in front of him, rather, we have 2 figures. One is, who's this guy? We've gone through this a few times. Some of you guys will know. Yeah, this is Festus. Anybody know his first name? Porcius Festus. Actually, he probably had like 6 names, but only 2 are listed in the Bible. And he is the Roman governor of Judea. And they are in Caesarea, which is the Roman capital of Judea. Who's this? This is King Agrippa. King Agrippa. King Agrippa is also sort of a Roman. We said this a couple of weeks ago. He's Jewish-ish, but he was raised in Rome, actually. This is a very interesting fact about his life. I mean, King Agrippa grew up playing with the Emperor Tiberius's nephews. Like, he was raised in the height of Roman culture and power, right in the center of the city of Rome, which at the time, in many ways, was the center of the world, at least the Western world. He is sort of a vassal king. So the Romans were trying to control different parts of this really unruly part of the world by having somebody who was Jewish, but really they had trained to be a Roman, run the show. So he was ruling sort of the northern parts, like up near Galilee, where Jesus had lived. And at this moment, kind of like Pontius Pilate had, Porcius Festus was ruling Judea. So this is a while after Jesus, at least maybe 25 years or more after Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. That's too much history, I know. Okay, here's the thing about these guys. We looked at, last week Tyler read some of these verses, right? And so what Paul says is, he says, why should any of you consider it incredible or unbelievable that God raises the dead? He says, I'm standing here on trial because I've been preaching about Jesus. My hope is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And by hope, he doesn't just mean some wishy-washy thing. He's saying he believes. In fact, Paul knows that Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead. He died and he came back. And so his hope is that one day, because of that, all human beings will come back to life from the dead. There will be a resurrection. And we saw, Tyler read this last week, where Festus cries out at Paul. What's Festus about to yell at Paul? Does anybody know? He's about to yell, you're out of your mind. You've lost your mind. So Paul is giving all this evidence for the resurrection. He's saying, look, I didn't used to believe this. I used to believe that the people who were following Jesus were crazy. I used to persecute them. I used to attack them. But what happened to me, let me tell you what happened to me. He's gone through this whole thing. He says, guys, I was on the road to the city of Damascus, and this light appeared to me in the sky, and it blinded me. And Jesus himself spoke to me out of the sky. And he said, why are you persecuting me? I am alive. He's giving Festus and Agrippa all this evidence that the resurrection actually happened. But let's see Festus's response here. At this point, Festus interrupts Paul's defense. Festus finally can't take it anymore. And he says, Paul, you are out of your mind. He shouted. Your great learning is driving you insane. So in some sense, it doesn't matter what evidence Paul brings to Festus. Festus is not going to believe. Why? Because Festus thinks it's crazy to believe that anyone could rise from the dead. So any evidence that comes to Festus, okay, the tomb was empty when they went there, and there had been soldiers guarding Jesus' tomb, and when those soldiers ran away, scared like crying children because there was this blinding light, whatever evidence is brought to prove that Jesus rose from the dead, Festus just will not believe it. Why? Part of why is that Festus does not really believe in God. Festus is a Roman. He maybe kind of believes in the gods, but the Romans' religion was much more like just a bunch of superstitions, okay? Like you've got to, throw salt over your shoulder before you do certain things, or you got to, cut open a certain kind of animal before you go on a journey to the east, because if you don't, bad things will happen. It was almost more like a religion of magic and good luck. There was no God like the God of the Bible in their worldview, in their minds, in their hearts. He does not believe that a God like the God that the Bible describes, he does not believe that kind of God actually exists. That's why he can't. None of the evidence that God will raise the dead that he already has, none of that counts for him. And this is the case for so many people in our culture today. They simply do not believe. And I would like you to examine your own heart. Do you believe that there is a God like the God that the Bible describes? A God who created the whole world out of what? Nothing. Out of nothing. He simply spoke it into being. If that kind of God exists, then why would you think it's impossible that people would rise from the dead? If God could create the entire world, the entire universe out of nothing, then he could absolutely, it's not even difficult for him to bring back every dead person who's ever lived. Well, what if their bones are scattered all over the world? No problem. What if they were cremated? No problem. None of it is a problem for a God like that, if there really is a God like that. But Festus doesn't believe that. Agrippa is actually like many of us, and this image, we're taking some time to develop this because this is very powerful. Agrippa is caught. He's caught between two things. He grew up in Rome, seeing what kinds of things are in Rome. Anybody been to Rome? Yeah, a couple of people. I mean, what is it like to be there in front of some of those monuments? How do they feel? How big are they? They're massive. Massively huge. Or what is it like to be in front of the Egyptian pyramids? That was part of the I've never been there. I want to go someday. But you can imagine what it would be like, right? They're just colossal. They're so in your face. They're so huge. And they're right there. You can see them. You can touch them. I was just in Las Vegas. Ugh. My mom lives near Las Vegas, which is why I was there. But what's it like to be on the Las Vegas Strip? Everything's just massive, and it's in your face, and it's trying to get your attention all the time. Agrippa knows deep down that there is a God, that the God of the Bible is real. But he's grown up in Rome, does he see God every day? I asked you at the beginning, can you see God? He doesn't see the God of the Bible all the time. What he sees is the Romans and all their amazing power and everything that they have. This is just like us. Do you see the God of the Bible every day? No, you don't. Now, some of you are going to argue with me. We'll get to that in a minute. Yes, I see him. You don't see the God of the Bible every day, not in the way that you see all the stuff streaming into you off of Netflix and Disney Plus, and not in the way that you see, all the people around you in the physical world, which is just overwhelming. You don't see the God of the Bible all the time like that. And so I could imagine Festus saying, if there's a God, like you imagine there's this God of the Bible, why doesn't he just show up? Where is he? Why can't we see him? But Paul knows that Agrippa really does believe. I told you 2 weeks ago, Agrippa's dad, remember the story about Agrippa's dad? Agrippa's dad had blasphemed against God, okay, publicly. People had started to say to Agrippa's dad, "You are a God, you're a God." And he was like, "Yes, I am a God." And then the Christians had been praying that God would remove this guy or change his heart in some way, and he suddenly had a heart attack and died publicly, right after he received worship from God. So that's another thing that happened while Agrippa was growing up. He watched his dad suddenly drop dead after blaspheming against the God of the Bible. Whoa. Agrippa knows deep down, and this is what Paul says to him. In response to Festus, he says, "I'm not insane, Festus. What I'm saying is very reasonable. There is a God like the Bible says." And the king, meaning Agrippa, the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. And I think as Paul looks at him, he looks into Agrippa's eyes and he sees it. He sees that Agrippa, deep down, Agrippa's been living for all this other stuff and the world's been right in his face, but deep down, Paul can see that Agrippa believes in the God of the Bible. I can see that you do. All right. Today's message, Resurrection and the Prophets, let's clear something up about God here. We need to clear this up for Festus, and we need to clear this up for Agrippa, and we need to clear this up for you and me. We've said a number of times, the thing about God is, he brings the dead back to life, yeah, but here's another thing about God, and in some ways this is for many people the biggest problem about God. He's currently invisible. The thing about God is he's currently invisible. You can't see him. Now, there are going to be two reactions to this, and you can check your heart, see where your heart's at. Maybe you have one of these two reactions. Some people will react to this and say, in their heart will say, well, yeah, that's because he's a fairy tale. It's not real. He's invisible because he's just made up. Others of you in your hearts are saying, he is not invisible. I see him every single day. But he is invisible, right? Jesus himself said, or John, talking about Jesus, said, no one has seen God. No one has seen God except the one who came from heaven, except Jesus himself. So there is a real sense, we have to admit, in which God is invisible. And so this is a big objection for a lot of people, and it contributes to this feeling that resurrection can't be possible because there is no God like the God of the Bible. So why? Why is God invisible? Why doesn't he just show up? Have you ever encountered somebody like this? I had a roommate in college right after I became a Christian. I was super intense, and I was just like telling about Jesus all the time to everyone around me. And I told my roommate about Jesus every single day until he probably wanted to barf. And, at one point he says to me, look, I'll believe why doesn't he just show up, okay? If you can pray and get your God to just do something right in front of my eyes, then I'll believe, okay? I mean, it doesn't have to be like, appearing in the sky for the whole world. Just have him, appear as like a glowing light in front of me right now or something. And then I'll believe. I didn't really know what to say to my friend, Adam, at that time. I was kind of like, well, he's probably not going to do that. I know what I would say now. I'm sure Adam is not listening to this, but who knows, maybe. Other people have said, why doesn't God just appear in the sky, right? If he wants the whole world to know, why doesn't he just show himself, right? Why doesn't he just show up like this, right? Why doesn't he just do the Zeus thing, right? Then the whole world would know that there's a God, right? Well, actually, I'm not sure that they would. If you saw that in the sky, how exactly would you react? I don't know. I don't know how you would react. But in any case, there's a whole nother reason why God doesn't show up like this. And it's a very important reason to understand about God and how he interacts with us. He's trying to interact with you pretty much every moment of every day, your entire life. But he does it in very, very gentle, soft ways. And we've got to talk about why. Okay? When God shows up, it's the end of the world. This is why he is currently invisible. And if you think about it for a couple of minutes with me, you're going to see that it makes total sense. Napoleon was an extremely strong personality, right? That whole army had sworn to destroy him. When he showed up, the whole army basically worshipped him. What if you had been a person in that army? I mean, what sort of freedom would you have felt in that moment? I mean, what if you'd been like the one guy who didn't want to join with Napoleon's army? What would your choices have been? Either join and worship Napoleon or run for your life. Those were your only choices at that point once Napoleon had showed up. Napoleon is one of the strongest human personalities in history. He had some of the most personal presence that any human being has had, I think. How much personal presence do you think the God of the Bible has when he shows up in his fullness? If he were to just show up kind of completely, the way that Napoleon did, if the God who made the universe were to just show up, not in the way he did with Jesus, which was another example of him being as extremely gentle as he could possibly be. If he were to show up in the fullness of who he really is, what would it be like? Would you have any choice left at that point? You see, what God is trying to do is he's trying to give you freedom. Think of those strong personalities in your life, right? Sometimes it's hard when you're around those people to even know what you think if you're maybe a milder personality. Have you ever had that experience? I've had that experience so many times. Like when I was around my dad when I was a kid. Often I couldn't even tell what I really thought because his presence was so strong in my life. What would it be like when God shows up? Will there be any freedom left? We've been talking about free will previously in our Romans series. Will you have free will left when God shows up in his fullness? The only choices at that point will be to worship him or to run for your life, but there will be nowhere to run. In Revelation, it says that the kings of the earth will cry out to the mountains, fall on us, and just bury us in the earth to protect us from the presence of this one who has arrived. That's what it will be like. God is hiding. So if you were God and you knew that this is how your presence would affect human beings, and you wanted them to love you and choose to follow you, what would you do? How would you communicate with people? Well, maybe you would do a number of things. How would you choose to communicate and still give them freedom? Maybe you would speak in whispers. Maybe you would talk to people not in a booming voice from the sky, but maybe you would put thoughts in their minds that are clearly from you. Maybe you would speak to them through circumstances in their life. Maybe you would speak to them through other people who knew you a little bit better. Maybe you would speak to them in dreams. All of these things are things that billions of people say God is doing to them all the time. The other thing you might do, because you can speak to people in whispers and you can speak to people in dreams, but those things are all kind of vague communication, right? The other thing you might do if you were God and you were worried about overwhelming human beings is you might choose particular people. People who already loved you from the deepest place in their heart. And you might choose to be a little more direct with them. You might show them, you might speak to them clearly so that they could go tell other people. The people that God chose to do this, we call the prophets. Let's look at one experience of one prophet and what it was like when God showed up in his life. Oh my goodness. If you are a person who has ever said, why doesn't God just show up and prove that he's real? Read this with me and ask yourself the question, is that what you really want him to do? Ezekiel was a person who already loved God with all his heart. He had already given God his whole life, and he wanted to follow him completely. And here's what happened to Ezekiel at the age of 30 in a province of Babylon by the Kebar Canal. In my 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day, this is a distinct thing that happened in his life. He's trying to tell you this really happened, although he doesn't know how to describe it properly. While I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. And there the hand of the Lord was on him. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north. He is trying to describe to us something here that is literally indescribable. So he's picking the most powerful things, you'll see him do that, to try and explain what it was like. I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. I don't even know what they were. They were some sort of creature that's alive. In appearance, their form was like a human. They looked somewhat human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Ezekiel was terrified of these things that he saw. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. The pictures he's painting are the most powerful high-tech things in his time. Under their wings and on their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked something like a vault. It looked kind of like the sky or like some immense structure, and it sparkled like crystal, and I can't really tell you what it was like other than to say it was literally awesome. Under the vault, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings. It was like the roar of rushing waters. It was like the voice of God himself, like the tumult of an army. It was like 100,000 men marching and chanting. That's what their wings sounded like. And when they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli. He's thinking, we would probably say lights and brilliant and fireworks, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal. I saw what looked like a man, except he's glowing metal. He's like lava. He's a glowing lava man full of fire. And from there, he looked like fire above that. And brilliant light surrounded him. I almost couldn't look at him, Ezekiel is saying. He was like the appearance of a rainbow. You can see Ezekiel searching for images to describe what he saw. And what was this? Here's what Ezekiel says. This wasn't even God showing up in his fullness. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. This was sort of a copy of what's around God. I fell face down. He falls flat on his face as though he's dead at the voice that's speaking to him. And then here's what he says a couple of chapters later, after he describes everything that God says to him in this moment. God says, "Son of man, listen carefully, take to heart all the words I speak to you. Go to your people, but watch this. The Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me a loud rumbling sound, as the glory of the Lord rose from the place where it was standing. It was the sound of the wings, the sound of the rumbling." Let me take you to Ezekiel's reaction at the very end. "Then the Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and in the anger of my spirit, with the strong hand of the Lord on me." Do we have one more verse there? "I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv in the Kebar River, and there, where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, deeply distressed." God chooses to speak to Ezekiel a little bit more directly than he speaks to the rest of us. And Ezekiel fell on his face as though dead. He was a person who already loved God with all of his heart, yet the experience filled him with bitterness and anger. He describes it as the strong hand of the Lord, and it took him 7 days of writhing in agony before he could speak about it. Adam, my friend from college, or anybody else, are you sure that you really want the Lord to show up in your life like that and prove who he is? He's speaking to us all the time in very gentle ways. Now, we're going to go through just a few verses here. This is what happened with the prophets. This is the experience they went through. Are you glad that you don't have to go through it? One day we will be able to see the Lord and be with him and be in his presence after he has prepared us and done an immense amount of work through his son Jesus. After we pass through death and come back to life, we will be able to be in his presence without being destroyed and overwhelmed by it. And that will be a glorious day. But I, for one, am glad that in God's mercy, he has not chosen me to be one of these people. But these people had a very particular calling, and he spoke very clearly to them. So let's go through. I'm just going to take you through 4 sections, 4 verses here to wrap up. What did God say to these guys about resurrection? Let's start with Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 37, so same guy we just looked at, God says this to him about resurrection. He picks him up and he takes him to a valley. This is in a vision. And the valley is filled with bones. Puts him in the middle of a valley. It's filled with bones. And he asks him a question. This is an amazing moment in the Bible. God asks Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" So it's a valley full of human bones. God gave Ezekiel all kinds of very disturbing images. It's a graveyard. He says, can these bones ever live again? And look at Ezekiel's answer. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Like, you're asking me if these bones can live again? You're the one. I love Ezekiel's relationship with God. But he goes on to tell Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones. And then what we see is that the bones come back to life. Actually, this one's kind of long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing through. You can find it in Ezekiel 37 if you want. But God says he will make breath come back to the bones. He'll attach tendons and make flesh come upon the bones and cover them with skin, and he'll put the breath of life back into them. This is a strong vision of the resurrection of the dead that's given to Ezekiel. And in the vision, God makes Ezekiel actually say it to the bones. Wake up, come back to life, breathe, be clothed with flesh. And the bones in front of Ezekiel's eyes in this vision do. He watches something that today would be like CGI animation in some crazy movie, right? Tendons and flesh appear on the bones. The bones start to shake. Then they come back together. They reform into human bodies. And then they start to regrow all of their flesh. It's an astonishing vision. At the end, God tells him, this is a vision about how Israel is going to come back to life, even though they've abandoned me. But it's also, for Ezekiel, this clear indication that one day the dead are going to rise. It's the first, in some ways, the first really clear indication to the prophets. Let's go to our second verse. So God gave Ezekiel this powerful vision that the dead might rise someday. We're not sure exactly what that means. Does it mean literally that they will actually rise? Dead people, dead bodies? This is Isaiah 53, and if you know this chapter, what is Isaiah 53 about? It's a prophecy about Jesus' death on the cross, way before he was born or anyone knew of him. It's a prophecy about the Messiah dying. And what we see in this section in verses 10 to 12 is that now Isaiah is being given a word by God that says one man will die. There is one man who will actually die, and he will physically rise from the dead. He will come back to life. It's the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. The Lord's going to make his life an offering for sin, yet he's going to see offspring, children. Who are Jesus' children? Us. He's going to prolong his days, even though he's going to die. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. He'll suffer, but then he'll see the light of life. And you can see as you go to the next verse here, verse 12, you can see that he actually died. He poured out his life unto death and was numbered among the transgressors. So here Isaiah is told very clearly, one of the people God has chosen to speak to directly, not in the gentle way that he speaks to most of us, but in a much stronger way, directly. He says there's one man who's going to come. He's going to give his life for the whole world. He is physically going to die, but he's going to physically come back to life from the dead. Isaiah 26, Isaiah is given also a vision of all those who believe in God coming back to life. Bodily. This is what Isaiah is given from God. Your dead will live, Lord. That is, those who believe in God, who trust him, they will live again. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. What a vision that is. God is speaking to all of us all the time in so many different ways. He spoke to a few people very clearly, and look at the kinds of things he says to them over and over again. The dead are going to come back to life. Do you believe it? If you believe that there is a God like the God of the Bible, there is no reason why this can't happen. And he says over and over again, he's been trying to tell us that it's going to happen. This is our final verse for today. And we'll wrap up and continue in worship with another song here. Here's what he says to Daniel, who also had overwhelming visions from God. Visions that made him lay sick in bed for months at a time after the vision. It's what God says to Daniel. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Some to everlasting life, but others to everlasting contempt. All the dead, not even just those who believe in God, all those who have ever died will one day come back to life in their bodies. Whoa. Let's pray, and we'll continue in worship.